For simplicity's sake, I'm going to preach from here this morning. Simplicity, and I gave my microphone away to to one of our actors, but well worth it. We took a slight detour last week for Remembrance Day, a slight detour away from this sermon series we've been in for several weeks now about what it means to be church, to be a people on mission with and for Jesus. It was a very slight detour, in fact, because being a people actively and intentionally engaged in pursuing peace is certainly part of our mission. It's hard to claim that we worship the Prince of Peace if peace isn't one of the aims of our life together within this church and part of our work in the world outside of this church. Not a passive peace, mind you, an active peace. Not a peace defined by the absence of violence or animosity or tension, but a peace defined by the presence of hope and joy, and especially love. Presence is a word that we keep coming back to. Have you noticed? It's not something I've gone intentionally looking for as I've prepared the messages for this series. It just keeps popping up in these texts that we are looking at together, which shouldn't be surprising, really. Presence is part and parcel of the gospel. We worship and proclaim Jesus, who is the Word made flesh, who came and dwelt among us. And as we will hear again in a few short weeks when Advent begins, the Jesus who is Emmanuel, God with us. That's presence with a capital P. Presence is also part and parcel with love. It's how love is given and received, experienced and embodied. And since love is what Jesus calls us to above all else, love of God, love of neighbor, love of one another as he first loved and continues to love us, then presence is something we ought to keep coming back to again and again. If we develop or come to adopt an approach to mission that isn't connected or concerned with presence, then something is off. Enter then Jesus' encounter with a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. A famous and familiar story to many of us, which I will submit has much to teach us about how to be on mission with and for Jesus by teaching us how to be present. Teaching us how to be present like Jesus was present in a place like the city of Sychar in Samaria. The kind of place that Jesus has commissioned us to go. As we have read in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, all Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And who better to learn from than Jesus himself, right? So how does Jesus lead the disciples into Samaria? Well, the first thing for us to note, even though it seems rather obvious, is that Jesus leads the disciples into Samaria. He doesn't expect the Samaritans to hear about all the wonderful things that he and they are doing in Jerusalem and Judea and come down to him. Jesus takes the disciples there, even though there wasn't a place that people like them went. That's no small thing. It was no small thing in Jesus' day. It's no small thing in our day. One of the things that we have to understand is that Samaria isn't just a region between Judah and Galilee. Samaria is a metaphor for any place that we avoid or prefer to avoid because of those people. whoever those people are or happen to be. People not like us, people who view God differently, who worship differently, who do any number and manner of things differently from the way that we do them. That's one reason why we wanted to present the essence of this story through an adaptation set in a coffee shop. Coffee shops and cafes are the community wells of our day and time. And it reminds us that Samaria is still very much with us in the 21st century in North America. And it confronts us with a pressing missional question. Where is Samaria for us? Is it Maybell? Scarborough? Northern Ontario? It doesn't have to be just one place. But wherever it is for us, Jesus didn't let those first disciples simply go around it or ignore it. And he won't let us do that either. The second thing to note is that what Jesus does once he and the disciples are in Samaria. He goes to a local well, a place where the locals normally go. Again, not expecting them to come to him. He chooses a place that's integral to the life of the community. But this particular well is actually even more than that. It's not just any local hotspot, this well. This well is a plot of common ground between Jews and Samaritans. It's Jacob's well. Jacob, whom both Jews and Samaritans claimed as a patriarch. One of the reasons why we tend to avoid the Samarias and the Samaritans of our world is that we tend to latch on to what makes us different when we encounter other people. We tend to latch on to the things that we disagree about. Differences irk us. As much as we say we value and celebrate diversity, it's much easier and more comfortable to be with folks who are like us, who talk like us, who dress like us, who see things from the same perspective that we do. So differences tend to be the things that often stand out and are most noticeable when we come in contact with other people, especially for the first time. But differences don't have to be the things that we respond to or define relationships by. We can choose to find and focus on something, even if it's only one small thing. We can choose to focus on something that we have in common and then go from there. It might take a bit of effort and energy, but not that much more effort and energy. Mostly what it requires is intention. And that's what Jesus chooses to do when he decides to take a rest at this particular well, Jacob's well. And everything that unfolds in this story starts from this place of commonality. Thirdly, when we meet others, those who are different, even when we meet them intentionally, missionally, on these plots of common ground, and we seek to engage one another based on what unites us rather than what divides us. When we make that choice, we set the stage for transformation to begin taking place. Transformation that takes place for both parties. Now, you may object, wait a minute now, Jesus doesn't change here. Fair enough. But think for a minute about who Jesus represents in this encounter. And apply that to what Jesus has to say to the Samaritan woman. When he says to her, "Believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. Worship in spirit and in truth, not in Jerusalem as the Jews do, not on this holy mountain in Samaria as the Samaritans do, but everyone moving more fully and faithfully toward God and the worship of God. It's not one side moving toward the other. That's the goal of Jesus inviting us all along for the ride. But in order for this process of mutual and mutually beneficial transformation to gain traction, how we meet at these points of common ground matters as much as the willingness to meet. So notice what Jesus does when the woman of Samaria first comes along. Jesus asks her for help. "Give me a drink," he says. Too often, even with the best of intentions, when we do venture into the Samarias of our world, we venture there with an attitude that says, "Hi there. We're the smart, hip, cultured, successful people from Jerusalem. We've come here to help you. We've come here to save you. We've come here to make everything okay," which often really means we've come here to make it how we want to see it, how we think things ought to be here. As if we have all the answers, as if we have everything to teach and nothing to learn, which isn't true. It's never true. The first disciples could never have become all that Jesus had called them to be if they had stayed put in Jerusalem or only ventured a little further afield, if they had stayed where things were familiar and tried to make things familiar wherever they went. Yes, they had a message to bring, as we do. Yes, they had a witness to give, as we do. But they also had things to see and to hear and to learn, just as we do. Because God was in the world long before any of us ever showed up, and God will remain in the world long after all of us have ceased to be. And God is always out in the world, at work, ahead of us, beckoning us to come and join God, to come and join the Holy Spirit in the work of God's mission. It's never our mission, it's God's mission. John 4 isn't the only time that we see the first disciples visit Samaria. Peter and John, at least, go back in Acts chapter 8. And what they witness when they go back is the Holy Spirit falling on these Samaritans, these unclean, uncouth people whom many of the Jews shunned. They witnessed the Holy Spirit falling on the Samaritans just as the Holy Spirit had fallen on the disciples in the upper room in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. And I often wonder if Peter would have been as receptive to the Roman centurion Cornelius when agents of Cornelius showed up knocking at his door, begging him to come to his house. Cornelius, an unclean, uncouth Gentile. Would Peter have been as receptive to Cornelius in Acts 10 without his experience in Samaria, both with Jesus in John 4 and with the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 8? Because God used all of this to expand his understanding of this gospel that Peter has been called to proclaim, expand his understanding of how God is at work in the world. All of it expanded and transformed Peter's own understanding of his mission, the church's mission, and God's redemptive work. And that happened over time. Which brings us back again to this idea of presence being a key aspect of our mission. And not just presence, but a key aspect of what presence is involved with, and that is patience. Patience and persistence. As they converse, the woman of Samaria keeps trying to put distance between herself and Jesus. And Jesus keeps laying bridges between the gaps. He won't give up so easily. Each and every time, he lays a bridge across the gap. And this is one of the aspects of the conversation that Kristen wanted to highlight in the script of this dramatization. When she was working on the script, when she was looking at the Greek behind this text, this line, when Jesus says to the Samaritan woman, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you. I am the Christ. I am the Messiah." That word to speak, it means to speak, but not simply speaking with the intent to impart information. It can also mean speaking to break the silence, to announce one's presence, to make one's presence known. And it's the same verb, in fact, that we find in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, where it reads, "Long ago God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds." God is speaking to announce the good news of the gospel, speaking to break the silence, speaking to announce God's presence, to be seen and be made known. And that's how Jesus is speaking to the Samaritan woman here in John 4, breaking the silence, announcing God's presence in the flesh, in her midst, in our midst, as Emmanuel, God with us. That is part and parcel of our mission as the church, as the people of Jesus too. And it's what happens when we find these plots of common ground. But I think it reinforces for us Jesus' conversation here with the Samaritan woman that simply finding a plot of common ground, it isn't some magical portal to Narnia that we can just step on and step through and find this magical, loving, just, and peaceful world. No, these plots of common ground that we find, they're not gateways, they're fulcrums, places from which we can begin to do the work of lifting and building a more magical, loving, just, and peaceful world with the Holy Spirit leading and guiding us, by bearing witness, by testifying of the good news of the gospel, by helping to make God's presence known, by being attuned to the ways in which God is already making God's self known in the world, ahead of us, apart from us. And this is how we typically see change happen in our world. Over time, with patience and persistence, often with small things like conversations that happen while we sit on the side of a well or on a bench outside a coffee shop. It's how the gospel originally made its way to the ends of the earth. Over time, one conversation, one day, 1 hour, 1 minute at a time. Many of you know that Shane Claiborne is one of my spiritual heroes, currently alive and living in the world today. And before Shane Claiborne started his ministry, The Simple Way, he was taken with a quote that he saw posted in a community mission. And this is what it said: "Everybody wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes." Everybody wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes. And he was struck by the truth of this statement, because revolutions often begin and are sustained by all the unglamorous behind-the-scenes work, like doing the dishes, day in and day out, incrementally, over time. And that's, in fact, how the revolution that he has helped lead in North Philadelphia has taken shape. That's why he chose to call his ministry The Simple Way. It's rooted in simple acts done with great love, inspired by a quote of Mother Teresa's. Simple acts done with great love. Starting homework clubs in this neighborhood, getting to know the neighbors, not just by name, but as people. Planting gardens, giving and receiving drinks, finding plots of common ground, common interest in a neighborhood that had been forgotten and forsaken by the rest of the city. Announcing and helping to embody the good news of the gospel to the people living there, both by bearing witness in the community, but also learning from the community about how God was already at work there, how God was breaking the silence there. By giving love, by receiving love, by practicing presence day in and day out on these plots of common ground that they went in search for. Heavenly, intentional presence. And the Holy Spirit has taken those small things done with great love and made big things happen. What started as one group of committed Christians living in one house has now expanded out to some 20 houses. And that's just Philadelphia. That's not counting all the other houses and movements that the Simple Way has inspired around the world. But that's what the Holy Spirit can and does do with these simple things, these simple acts of great love that we do. The Holy Spirit takes them, multiplies them, and turns them into very big and significant things. So, Kingsway, as we find our way back out into the world, as we begin moving toward Advent, as we begin moving out into the city of Toronto and all that lays beyond, may we too, like Jesus and those first disciples, like modern disciples like Shane Claiborne, may we go into Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and all the way to the ends of the earth, and do like Jesus did when he led the disciples to a well in Samaria. Because there are plenty of ledges and benches on which we can sit and find common ground, and there's never any shortage of dishes to do. Thanks be to God for the invitation to the journey. Amen.